I'm going to start with the Chairman of the Procedure Committee, Karen Bradley, on this matter, on this subject of global issues.
Thank you very much, Chair, and welcome, Prime Minister. Very good to see you. You will know, obviously know, that it's absolutely constitutionally appropriate for you to appoint whoever you wish to the Cabinet, and they can be members of the House of Commons or members of the House of Lords. But you will also understand that there is concern about how elected members of the House of Commons can properly scrutinise a departmental Secretary of State based in the House of Lords. And of course, we're talking about global issues here, and we're referring in particular to the Foreign Secretary. So I wonder, Prime Minister, how you think it might be most appropriate for members of the House of Commons to scrutinise the work of the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office and the Secretary of State.
Thank you. As you acknowledge, it's common practice for governments from all parties to appoint Secretary of State from the House of Lords. Indeed, that was the situation in 2008 and 9 with Lord Mandelson and Lord Adonis also serving as senior cabinet ministers from the Lords. So there's an established process for scrutiny which has been in operation for a long time. I know the Foreign Secretary was due to appear before the House of Commons Select Committee yesterday, which was rescheduled as a result of his attendance abroad at the funeral. But I know he's keen to do that, as well as increasing the amount of time he spends in the House of Lords answering questions. But the last thing I'd say is the Foreign Office also has another cabinet level minister, who is in the Commons, obviously, who can make statements and take questions.
I appreciate that, but I think there is real concern that one of those great offices of state, which is occupied now by a member of the House of Lords, will not have the normal scrutiny that we would expect in the House of Commons. And I'll give you an example of during the pandemic, the very early days of the pandemic, the then Foreign Secretary came to the House of Commons, made a statement and took hundreds of interventions, actually. It was a very long statement from many of us who had concerns about our constituents around the world and how we might get them home. It's only really the Secretary of State that can take those level of questions and get and the level of responses that we required. So I wonder if there are any thoughts you might have as to how we could introduce new procedures that may allow us to have similar scrutiny now.
I think I'd, in one sense, just echo what I said, is that this is not an unprecedented situation. We have had senior Labour peers who were in Cabinet from the House of Lords, two at once, in fact, for the last year and a half of the last Labour government. So it's long-standing practice, and clearly Parliament thought that it had the right appropriate mechanisms to hold those ministers to scrutinise them at the time. Now, obviously, if people have new suggestions, happy to consider them. Consideration would obviously need to be given to the practicalities and constitutional implications of that. Other committees, no doubt, would need to be consulted. But what I can say is, with regard to statements, as I said, there is another Foreign Office cabinet level minister in the Commons who has made all the statements since the appointment and taken questions. And again, I think in the survey that the Procedure Committee did, people expressed an interest in the Select Committees being the appropriate forum for that level of detailed scrutiny, and of course Foreign Secretary has agreed to appear before the House of Commons Select Committee as soon as schedules allow. He was meant to be there yesterday, but obviously travel intervened.
Well, thank you. My committee is looking into this at the moment. We have taken evidence, so we'll be reporting in the new year, and I hope that the government will be able to act on our recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Under time. Excellent. Prime Minister, in a single word, what would you say is the greatest strategic challenge facing the United Kingdom?
I think the increasingly complex and hostile international environment is something that over the past year has occupied more of my time than one might have anticipated. And you can see that not just in the situation in Russia and Ukraine, but we've talked in the past in this forum about the risk posed by China's activities, Iran, and now most recently in the Middle East. In particular, the situation in the Red Sea is deeply concerning. As a maritime nation, we've always believed very strongly in free and open shipping lanes. That is now being threatened by malign actors, and it's just further evidence that the international picture is both complex and more challenging. And previously we, I think, may have taken many of these things for granted. It's clear that we can't, and we need to invest in our defence capability and strengthen our alliances to keep everyone at home safe and protect our economy too.
Where is Russia-Ukraine in the ranking? of the issues?
I mean, very much uppermost in our minds. As we know, I think we've been very clear that for Ukraine to be defeated is existential for Euro-Atlantic security, which is why we have been at the forefront of the response to Russia's aggression. I think Ukraine would rightly consider us one of their closest allies. We've stood shoulder to shoulder with them from the beginning of this crisis, but also been ahead of all our allies in providing particular capabilities at times that they most needed it, whether that's tanks, or most recently long-range weapons, combat air training. Again, all evidence of the UK being a step ahead of everyone, leading the global conversation, and that we will continue to do that because this is existential for Euro-Atlantic security, that Russia cannot succeed in its efforts.
What would be the consequence of Russia retaining illegally held territory for a long period?
As I said, I think existential for Euro-Atlantic security. There's a range of different countries that already are seeing the impact of hostile Russian activity in their countries, on their borders, and it's important that a strong deterrent is sent to Russia, that this type of aggression, this flagrant breach of the international rules-based system of territorial integrity won't be tolerated. And that's why we have taken a lead in providing support to Ukraine, galvanized international opinion behind it. But I'd also say it is broader than Euro-Atlantic security because, as I've echoed earlier, I think the international rules-based system more generally is under pressure in lots of different areas. And it's important that we send a strong signal, not just to Russia, but all of those around the world who would seek to undermine that order. We've spent decades building it up, that their aggression will be met with a strong response.
So we've been through the autumn statement. We know what we're spending on Ukraine in 23-24, I believe 2.3 billion. Why was there no announcement made about 24-25, and when will the announcement be made, and how much will it be? It
will be made in due course. We're having active dialogue with the Ukrainians. I spoke to President Zelensky just the other week on this to make sure that the aid that we are putting in place can be most effective in supporting them with their ambitions for next year. Now, they are obviously in the process of developing their plans for next year, and we are helping them do that together with our closest allies. But before we say exactly how, what quantum and what we're going to do to support them, it's important that we work with them to have a clear and coherent, unified view of what it is that they are planning on achieving next year. And those conversations are active. As I said, we've had people back and forth, and I spoke to President Zelensky the other week. We will continue to support them very strongly next year. I can, of course, give you that assurance. But the precise form, detail and quantum will be outlined in due course once we finalise those conversations with the Ukrainians.
Sarah Champion.
Hi, Sarah. Just maybe if I could about it just before, the other thing is, it's not just about next year. I think this is an important point because we, in February, called at the Munich Security Conference for longer-term multilateral security assurances for Ukraine, because I think that is an important part of building that deterrence. And many countries have signed that similar declaration, and we are also having conversations with Ukraine about how to broaden the support that we give them, not just militarily, but to bring them into the Euro-Atlantic family with other economic and assistance. So I think it is broader than just the military support, and we need to start thinking longer term, not just about 1 year at a time, in terms of a journey and a direction of travel. It's just an important point to make. Sarah, sorry.
Ready? I'm interested. Do you consider yourself a leader on the global stage?
I think others will make that determination. I'm very proud of the UK's leadership in multiple areas over the past 12 months. Ukraine being an obvious example. We were the leader to provide main battle tanks to Ukraine, first country to do that.
I'm interested in you.
Well, I stand here. Well, these are things that I have done on behalf of the UK. So again, at the end of the day, these are things we do as a country, as a government. But ultimately, I'm the one that takes the decisions. So we were the first country to provide main battle tanks, first country to provide long-range weapons, first country to provide training for combat air pilots. All of those have now been copied by other countries, rightly so, and we were the first country to call for multilateral long-term security assurances.
Let me ask
Again,
you...
and that's just in the Ukraine space.
Well, that's just in defence space, and I want to talk to you about development and humanitarian.
I was just about to get onto that, so
Thank you. If I could ask my question.
Great.
Yemen is in the news again. What's not being commented on yet is since 2015, Yemen is the world's worst humanitarian crisis. Despite this, you made successive cuts to their aid as Chancellor. And this year you cut UK aid to Yemen to a third of what it was in 2019-20. As penholder of the UN Security Council and a country in such desperate need, do you now regret those cuts that you made?
No. So
No.
when it comes to the aid budget, right,
Sorry, your first answer was no, you don't.
I don't regret the cuts to the overall aid budget, the decision I made as Chancellor that was actually approved by the House of Commons in a vote. Now, I appreciate the Labour Party opposed it. I guess the question for them is, and for everyone that opposed it, in fact, is where would they have £5 billion from?
The question, Prime Minister, with respect, is do you regret that, cutting aid to one of the worst humanitarian crises on the planet?
Yeah, so what I think is the right thing for the UK, given the fiscal situation that we face in recovering from the pandemic, that we reduced our aid budget from 0.7 to 0.5. I think that was the right thing to do. We remain, it's an important point, you asked about leadership, we remain one of the largest aid spenders anywhere in the world, both as an absolute amount, and we'll spend around £12 billion this year, but also as a percentage of GDP out of large economies. We are one of the largest contributors to individual funds, whether that's the Global Fund or indeed the Green Climate Fund. So across the board.
I think this is the answer you gave to me 6 months ago in my last
and the facts remain the same, they haven't changed.
Yeah, but I'm interested in your position on things. So do you see a correlation between what's happening in the Red Sea now and the fact that the UK and indeed the international community has turned its back on Yemen for a very long time?
No, I don't think that's right. And I don't think when I talk to my international peers about this situation as we're actively doing, not a single one of them has made that point.
Okay.
And we're actively involved right now, particularly with the US, but a much broader coalition in standing up an operation to provide deterrence and protect our open seas. That is an incredibly important thing for the UK to be doing, given it's something that we've always believed in. This is not about actually the situation in Israel and Gaza. This is about malign forces and the Houthis in particular taking advantage of a situation to try and escalate.
Thank you.
And that is having a real impact on the global economy, and we are playing our part as part of a broader international coalition.
Can I move you on to something?
But I think it's important on this point. So what we are doing.
You're not answering my point.
I am, because I think
you're giving me a policy answer to something else. Could I turn
No,
to
but I think it is important because
Prime
it's not
Minister.
just aid that will help the situation, it's also military deterrence.
And leadership.
And again, we were the first country after the US to send assets into the region. So HMS Lancaster, HMS Diamond, those they are in the region ahead of any other countries. That is leadership, and that's because we are providing deterrence for commercial shipping and also making sure that humanitarian maritime corridors remain
Thank you, Prime
open.
Minister. Can I bring you back to something I hope we agree on, which is global education, particularly education for girls. I'm enormously proud, as I'm sure you are, of the UK's investment in girls' education, including the UN-led Education Cannot Wait. But for hundreds of thousands of girls, their education will have to wait because you cut funds to the scheme by 87%. Why did you make that decision?
Again, I think on all these questions of aid, I appreciate that you and others will disagree, but I thought it was the right thing, given the fiscal and economic situation that the UK faced, that we temporarily reduced the aid budget from 0.7 to 0.5. Now, obviously, that's going to have implications for lots of different projects.
It's the choices that you're then making on things like girls' education.
Well, I think it's not fair to separate, because if you accept that choice but then don't agree with any of the subsequent choices that flow from that decision, it's hard to say that those things are consistent. So I appreciate that you actually don't agree with the decision to reduce the aid budget. The Labour Party doesn't agree. I think that £5 billion is £5 billion that we need to spend on domestic priorities right now.
Thank you.
So, and I do think that is an important distinction. Now, if you disagree with that, that's completely fine.
Thank you.
We have to move on.
Thank you. For my final question.
No, I'm sorry, we've run out of time. You've gone over already.
I unfortunately, that's the Prime Minister not answering my questions. But so my last one, Prime Minister, is Gaza. We've all been appalled at the loss of civilian life. I am optimistic that the motion, watered down motion from the UN, the UK is going to sign up to it. Is that correct?
It's our long-standing practice not to comment on our votes beforehand, especially when there's an active dialogue going on at the UN when negotiations are underway as we speak. But our position on this, and I'm sure we'll come to it, has been crystal clear about wanting this conflict not to last a moment longer than is necessary, and support Israel's right to defend itself, but that has to be done in accordance with international law. And again, you asked about leadership earlier. Again, we have taken a lead in providing more humanitarian aid into Gaza.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Thank you.
Alicia Cairns, Foreign Affairs Committee.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Prime Minister. Can you update us on progress to get British hostages home from the terrorist group Hamas who currently holds them?
Yes, I mean, I think hopefully everyone will understand there's a limit to what I can say publicly about this, but what I can say is we are working day and night to secure their safe release. Now, that involves lots of conversations with lots of different people. We are doing that, and this is part of why we've had discussions in the past with different people's views on ceasefires and pauses. For us, those have to involve the release of hostages. And it's clear that the last one that we had of these was broken because Hamas stopped releasing hostages, including specifically women. I don't think that was right. When I last spoke to the Emir of Qatar, I commended them for their efforts, and we're in dialogue with them in particular about trying to restart that process and to secure the safe release of all hostages, but obviously British hostages.
On the point of a ceasefire, your Foreign Secretary has used the phrase, and you have, a sustainable ceasefire. What are the conditions or criteria that need to be met for a sustainable ceasefire to be able to come into place?
Yes, I think, look, it's important for us to ceasefire to be sustainable, it's absolutely right to ask what are those conditions so that it doesn't collapse. Look, there isn't a perfect formula for peace, right? But what I can say is that a ceasefire is clearly not going to last if hostages are still being held, and that was your first question. And also if Hamas, whose stated aim is to destroy Israel, is still able to operate in underground tunnels and launch rocket attacks into Israel. So I think those are important facets that we need to grapple with. And ahead of a permanent ceasefire, what we'd like to see are immediate and sustained humanitarian pauses which allow release of more hostages and more aid to enter Gaza. And in particular, to go to the previous question about leadership, I think we were the first country to say to the Israelis they had to open Kerem Shalom crossing so we could get more aid in. That's something that I spoke to Prime Minister Netanyahu about myself, and I'm pleased that that is now happening, not in the quantities that we all want, but it is an improvement. Again, that is the UK showing leadership on this issue and making a real difference to people.
And I think we're all very grateful to see that additional aid opened. But when you last appeared before this committee, I warned you that I feared we were facing the Gaza crisis of 2023. Now, I didn't expect it to come in the form that it has. In response to my question, you called for Israel to adhere to the principles of necessity and proportionality, and you also said at the time that you urged Israel to show restraint. Can you give an example of where the UK has achieved restraint in the IDF's response to the horrific atrocities that took place on the 7th of October?
I mean, from the beginning of this, from my first visit to Israel, we have made repeated calls for Israel to adhere to international humanitarian law, to take every practical...
Where have we achieved restraint or a change in their behaviours? Because that's the goal of raising it with them, is to achieve an actual effect.
I mean, I'm obviously not the one making operational decisions on the ground, but we have consistently urged Israel where they can to avoid harming innocent civilians. Far too many have died, and that is about providing notice, providing safe areas, safe passage during the early phases of the conflict, but also about making sure that aid reaches those people who need it. I said early on, we focused on getting Rafah opened, which happened. Yeah. We also focused on making sure fuel was able to come in because that was necessary. But also, most recently, as I said, on Kerem Shalom, again, that has happened. So these are all proof points that the approach we're taking is yielding
on
outcomes.
The humanitarian side, it certainly is.
But those are all things that are making a real difference to people.
Yes, but they're not necessarily preventing bombings, targeting. So, for example, Biden has said that there were indiscriminate bombings taking place. Do you agree?
as I've been very clear, too many innocent civilians have died, and
So
we've been
therefore
very.
You agree that the targeting is indiscriminate. Therefore, if too many civilians have died.
I'm not privy to the precise targeting, but what I can say is clear that too many innocent people have died in this conflict.
But you will have received advice from government lawyers and submissions. Have any of those submissions or any advice you've received from lawyers or anyone within number 10 suggested that international humanitarian law is being broken?
No, again, the government never comments on the legal advice it receives. Now, that what is absolutely clear, I've been consistent throughout this from day one, we can't forget what happened. Right? Hamas perpetrated an appalling terror attack on Israel. Innocent people were slaughtered, and Israel has every right to defend itself, to ensure its security, make sure that nothing like that ever happens again to its citizens. We would do exactly the same.
But there
if
are
it was
also
us.
limits under international law.
And of course
to
there
the
are,
right
and
to
I've made
self-defense.
that point from the beginning, and we've consistently called on Israel to do that.
So
and
forgive
that
me
will,
though,
what we will always do.
But forgive me, Prime
and
Minister,
alongside that,
your current Foreign Secretary, when he was Prime Minister, was quite happy to state when he felt that international humanitarian law was being broken in Syria. Equally, James Cleverly's Foreign Secretary was happy to say that war crimes are taking place in Ukraine. So surely there is a precedent that you are able to say, if you believe that too many civilians are dying, that bombings have been indiscriminate and therefore that the principles of necessity and proportionality are not being upheld.
you're putting words in my mouth. Others may have said that.
Your exact words were too many civilians are dying. You've just repeated it here as well.
Yes, and now too many civilians are dying. Of course, too many civilians are dying. That is different from saying humanitarian law has been broken.
So
I've said every civilian, quite
where is the
frankly,
responsibility for too many civilians dying?
every civilian dying is a tragedy.
But where does the
civilian dying
responsibility
is a
sit for that
tragedy.
decision making?
Sorry?
Where does the responsibility sit for too many civilians dying?
Well, I mean, again, ask Hamas why they embed themselves in civilian
forgive me, Prime
populations.
Minister, but when we
I think that's a genuinely an extraordinary question. Yeah. Responsibility for civilians dying. There's two sides to this. Israel is trying to defend itself. If the terrorist organisation which is perpetrating these attacks is deliberately embedding itself inside civilian populations, then they have to accept responsibility for that.
But Prime Minister,
I think Israel is rightly should take every precaution to avoid harming civilians, but that will be very difficult if the precise organisation which has caused untold suffering to the Israeli people is hiding amongst civilians, knowingly doing so, knowingly putting them in harm's way. And it's important not to forget that that is what is going on here.
Very brief final question.
Yes, Prime Minister, nobody's forgotten the crimes against humanity that took place in Israel. There's no more equivalence between the two of them. However, whether it was Northern Ireland, where the UK police had to show restraint and ensure that civilians were not, loss of life was not out of line, disproportionate with the military objectives. When fighting Daesh as well, Daesh did the exact same tactics as Hamas, and yet we did not see this level of casualty. So therefore, will you do more to achieve actual restraint in some of the actions that are taking place on the ground?
We have repeatedly and will repeatedly call on Israel to show restraint, to operate within international humanitarian law, to take every possible precaution to avoid harming civilians, and crucially to allow far more aid to get into Gaza to actually help people. And that is what we are doing, and it is showing that it is working. As I said, the opening of Kerem Shalom is meaningful. We're also exploring alternative maritime corridors, which we've been clear, given our assets in Cyprus, we can play a leading role in. So we are working every which way to get more aid to the people who need it. We've already tripled our aid into the region, and we continue to have dialogue with all our partners about the future of Gaza post this conflict, and that involves my conversations with the Palestinian Authority and others to make sure that we can provide a future for the Palestinian people where they can live with dignity, prosperity and security. That is something that we are completely committed to and will continue to work very hard to bring about.
Thank you, Chair.
Dame Diana Johnson for the Home Affairs Select Committee.
Thank you, and good afternoon, Prime Minister. I want to ask you about 3 areas where you've made pledges or promises, and I'm going to ask short questions, so I'd very much appreciate short answers. The first one is around the legacy backlog in the Home Office, and you promised that that would be cleared by the end of this year, 92,000 cases. Will you have achieved that?
Well, we're not at the end of the year yet, so the final statistics have not been published, but we are making very good progress. I think the last published numbers show that the backlog is down by 80% from 92,000 down to 18,000, and that has partly come about because we've doubled the number of case
Yes,
workers.
we know that, Prime Minister. I just want to know whether you think you're going to meet the target that you've set yourself.
I said those are the latest figures. We'll continue to push through it. There will always be, obviously, as there always are, and you know this.
You don't sound very
better than
sure,
me.
Prime Minister.
Oh, well, we're doing absolutely everything we can. We set an ambitious target. I think when I was here, you were sceptical that we would get anywhere close to it, but it's already down by 80%.
80%, but you did say by the end of the year, and that's just a few days. Can I ask you then, what about the other 91,000 that's sitting there in the other backlog? When do you think that will be cleared?
Well, with the overall asylum backlog, I think at the same time as the 92 was about 131,000. That is down by 16%. Now, obviously, that's impacted by
when do you think it will
flow.
be cleared, Prime Minister?
I don't have a. We
you
haven't
don't
set.
have an idea when that will be cleared. The 91,000.
I know we haven't set a target for that publicly, but obviously, once the priority was clearing the initial legacy asylum
but
backlog.
You're not sure you'll do that.
Well,
okay.
That's your words, not mine. We
keen-
remain on track to do it, but we're not at the end of the year.
Right, well, I'm keen that I move on to my second question to you, which is about the pledge you made to stop the boats. So when will you have stopped the boats?
What's
the date for that?
Well, the first thing to say is we have made progress, and that is that the numbers this year are down by a third, which is considerable
They're still
progress.
the second highest on record, though, aren't they, this year?
They are, for the first ever time, down.
They're still the second highest, but what is the date?
There isn't a firm date on this because I've always
But
been
you
clear
said-
from the beginning.
You
I
said you'd going to stop the boat, so I just want to know
and
what
we
the
will
date
keep
is.
going until we do.
Okay.
This is not one of these things where there's a precise date
You don't
estimate
have a
on
date?
it. This is something where before I took this job, they had only ever gone up.
Okay.
And now they're down by a third. And an important part of finishing the job is having a deterrent for everybody.
Well,
and
can I
that's
come
why.
on to that? Can I come
Of
on to that?
course.
Because that's the Rwanda policy. So you've said that you want to see planes take off by the spring to Rwanda. That's one of the things you've said. Now, I understand that no airline is willing to actually contract with government to remove people to Rwanda because of reputational damage. Is that correct? There isn't an airline that you've got lined up to remove people?
I think we are, in terms of timing, I'd say I want to get flights off as soon as practically possible.
You need some planes to do that.
We do, but we also need to be able to pass the legislation through Parliament first.
Right, but on the plane point, which I'm asking you specifically about, do you have an airline that's ready to go?
I'm confident we will have the ability to send people to Rwanda. But
you
there
don't
are
have
many
an airline.
steps. You wouldn't expect me to comment on commercial conversations that are necessarily private, but I'm highly confident that we can operationalise the bill in all its aspects.
Okay.
That's not just about flights. There's many different steps that you need. But the legislation needs to get through Parliament first.
Okay, so we're not
and
clear...
as quickly as it passes, then we will work
we're not
to
clear if
operationalise
there's
the bill.
any airlines. Okay, the Migration and Economic Development Plan, which you signed up to when you were Chancellor, I think, with the then Home Secretary, we know that 290 million now has been spent or is about to be spent in the next few months. Could you just tell the Liaison Committee how much the total amount that you signed up to for that 5-year plan? How much else, what's the amount that we've got to pay in addition to the 290?
I think you know full well, because the Home Secretary has said this in Parliament multiple times before. We disclose these things on an annual basis, and beyond that we've disclosed the most recent
Do you think
numbers.
that fits with your claim around professionalism, integrity and accountability, that we can't actually know how much you've agreed will be sent to Rwanda?
As I said, it's absolutely right for what are commercially sensitive negotiations, that there is a degree of ability for the government to negotiate these things and then provide the appropriate level of transparency to Parliament, which it's doing on an annual basis.
So could I just ask you, the Deputy Prime Minister at the weekend said that the funding for Rwanda was unlimited. Is that correct?
I think what he's saying is the scheme is uncapped.
No, he said unlimited funding when he was pressed. I think it was on Times Radio.
I'm not sure. I didn't hear that. I'm not sure what I recognise. But the scheme in itself is uncapped, so we have the ability to send multiple people there. Obviously, there will be a degree of volume payments as well as fixed cost, which is
and is that the
public knowledge.
£169,000 per person that it'll cost to send someone to Rwanda as the Home Affairs, the Home Office impact assessment put forward?
I don't think that's an accurate characterisation of it, because what we don't know is the deterrent effect. Until the scheme has been operated, what we won't know is the final deterrent effect. Our belief is that there will be a significant deterrent effect, and that has to be compared, the cost of this scheme, has to be compared against the counterfactual, where the costs are forecast to rise into the double-digit billions of pounds for the asylum system if the numbers continue to rise. Now, so
Can I
this
just
has to be
ask you just
compared
on
to
that
what that
point?
Last
counterfactual...
question.
Can I just ask you on that point, does it worry you at all that the permanent secretary at the Home Office is still not willing to sign the Rwanda policy off because of the lack of value for money?
That's absolutely not what they said. They said it was entirely proper to pursue this scheme.
There was a ministerial direction,
Yeah,
Prime
and
Minister.
if you read the letter, I can find you the quote. They actually were very clear that it was
There's no
perfectly
evidence.
well, it's perfectly proper for the government to continue with this scheme
But
at
no
the
evidence.
time. No, because we're trying something that's never
Yeah,
been done
no,
before.
I understand that, Prime Minister,
But I think
there's
the words
no
they used were it was
evidence of
regular,
deterrence.
proper, and feasible for the Home Secretary to proceed with this policy in light of the illegal migration challenge that the UK is facing. It's a matter of record that a direction was required because we're doing something that hasn't been tried
Because
before.
there's no evidence it'll work. I think
But
that's
by
the-
definition, when you're doing something
Yes,
that hasn't...
yes.
Well, actually, no, I do
Yeah.
challenge that. We do have evidence that deterrence works. And our Albania partnership is evidence.
That's very different, Prime Minister.
Not really. It's a returns agreement with a country which allows us to return the vast majority of
You've
people
returned
who arrive
5%
illegally.
We
of
have to move on.
Albanians who've returned in small
I'll just
boats
finish it.
since
You said there's no
2020.
evidence. We have a returns agreement with Albania that's returned 5,000 people this country.
Not
the
small
numbers,
boats.
the numbers from Albania.
Not small boats.
Thank
All
you, Dame
returns
Diana.
serve to build a deterrence. The number of arrivals from Albania is down by 90%.
Thank you, Dame Diana.
New returns agreement, record returns, arrivals down by 90%.
Well, not from
I think
small
that's a
boats,
pretty good
Prime
indication
Minister.
that deterrence and returns works.
Dame Meg Hillier.
Well, returns are different to deterrence because that's an agreement, Prime Minister. The last Labour government was returning one person every 8 minutes at the end of the Parliament. How many people is this government returning?
This government last year returned about just over 20,000 people in various different ways.
Okay, so a little less than one every 8 minutes. We're going to do the maths on that. But you talked about disclosing the cost of the Rwanda project, Prime Minister, and you have repeated the line that it must be disclosed on an annual basis. It is perfectly normal and within the normal accounting rules in terms of reporting to the Public Accounts Committee and the departmental committees, in this case the Home Affairs Select Committee, to report on projects on a different basis, especially something that's a flagship. This is a flagship policy of yours, Prime Minister. So producing information in the annual accounts, which is 15 months after the last £100 million payment was made to Rwanda, is not acceptable. What is the problem about just being open and honest about something you signed off as Chancellor that you're now championing as Prime Minister that's a 5-year programme? What's the secrecy?
Because, as we've been very clear, it may well be that we want to have other conversations with other countries.
Okay, which other countries are you thinking of having a conversation with, Prime
But
Minister?
again, it wouldn't be right to talk about these things if we're having private conversations with countries about potential alternatives to add to our Rwanda policy.
sorry,
We've always been clear that that is something that the government would like to
Prime Minister,
explore.
I've been on the Public Accounts Committee now for 12 years, and I'm aware of lots of things that are talked about as being commercially confidential. And then when we ask to see the papers, they're not at all. I cannot see, nor can other members of my committee, what is commercially confidential about this that won't be commercially confidential when the accounts are produced. There isn't an arbitrary timeline when something stops being commercially confidential and then does. And is no longer confidential. There is no reason to have a 15-month delay between payments being made. The only reason this money was revealed was because somebody in Rwanda, possibly inadvertently, we don't know, there's an inquiry going on, released it to the International Monetary Fund, which itself is instructive, is it not?
I think we probably just have a different point of view on this. I think
No, Prime Minister, can I be clear? I chair the Public Accounts Committee, a constitutional committee of over 160 years standing, cross-party with 5 parties on it. I'm not playing a party political point. This is a public accounting point. You've been a renowned Chancellor of the Exchequer, took us through COVID. I think you understand those rules very clearly. So can we just be really clear? Why are you not sharing with Parliament and the public the money being spent on the Rwanda scheme? It's a 5-year project. You signed it off as Chancellor. You must have been content then, despite you now having to pass legislation to operationalisation it. Why did you not think about asking those questions then? You must have been asking those questions. Why can't you share that money with the money with us?
Again, there's a balance to be struck. There is annual transparency of these numbers to Parliament. I think that strikes
Prime
the right
Minister,
balance.
it is not the normal
appreciate you
transparency, Prime Minister, that is provided on other big projects, like, for example, High Speed 2, take one. I could give you many other examples. We were receiving 6 monthly reports laid to Parliament. That is the normal approach, and it is normal to negotiate this with the Public Accounts Committee on a routine basis. We do that regularly with other departments. It's a flagship policy of yours. What is there to hide? There should be nothing to hide.
The scale of HS HS2 compared to this, obviously just by order of magnitude, very different. I mean, phase one.
Oh, so
of
it's about the
HS2
scale of the project.
Again, all these things will be, there's an appropriate balance. I mean, HS2 was the single biggest project that the government is undertaking. The cost for phase one, which we'll be aware of, well north of 40.
Okay, well, I just make the final observation.
That's very different.
The HS2 6-monthly reporting was because the counting officer agreed with the Public Accounts Committee on a method and a frequency of reporting, and that is a normal thing that we often negotiate with departments. So I hope you could give some succour to the Home Office that if they do similar, they will have your full backing. Thank you.
Maybe there will be some correspondence about this matter. But I think it's interesting you've suggested the government is in conversation with third countries.
I didn't say that it was. I said that if it was, that would clearly be a reason that it would want to make sure it had the ability to conduct those conversations in private.
Right. So Bill Cash for the European Scrutiny Committee.
On that very question, Prime Minister, in Rome, you very rightly drew attention to the need to renegotiate what I would call the global Gordian knot of out-of-date EU, ECHR and international immigration laws, including EU retained law, which my European Scrutiny Committee is reporting on at this moment. From the position last month, I'm well aware that when I was in Madrid with the other European Scrutiny Committee chairman, that they are actually tearing their hair out because, as I mentioned on second reading, they're having EU refugee quotas and compulsory fines imposed on them by majority vote. And of course we're not in that position because we're out of the EU and because of Brexit. So do you agree that if we have a long enough timetable, if you know what I mean, to be able to engage in proper discussions before the committee stage on the Rwanda bill, so that in line with what our own parliamentary sovereignty provides, our own laws, our own lawmaking via our own voters and our own courts applying explicit laws, particularly in respect of out-of-date international obligations, then we would have a massive Brexit dividend, because we could then lead internationally and at the same time have a bill which would fully work, which is an enormous opportunity for us to get it right. And if we get that right, then we will satisfy the national interest.
That was a 2-minute question. You may have a 2-minute answer.
So I think, Sybil, we share the same objective, which is to ensure that we can have proper control of our borders. Illegal migration is wrong, it's not fair, and that's why I've made it a priority to stop it. An important part of that is our new legislation, which will give us the powers we need to make sure the Randa scheme can be up and running as quickly as practically possible. So we remain committed to the legislation, and we're always happy to have dialogue with colleagues about how to make sure that legislation can be as effective as possible, given the environment we're operating under, and thank you for your input into that. More broadly, I think you also alighted on the fact that this is a conversation that we are not in isolation in having, and certainly my conversations with other leaders have demonstrated they also have a frustration with the situation that they're all dealing with in their countries. This issue of illegal migration is only growing both in number and as a challenge. Everyone is looking at creative ways to address it. Italy have, as you know, embarked on a partnership with Albania, and that is, I think, just a sign of things to come, which is why I am going to keep talking to other leaders, particularly in Europe, about how we can work together to make sure all the frameworks that we're operating under are fit for today's age and allow us to stop this awful trade that criminal gangs are plying, where innocent people are losing their lives.
Thank you very much. And could I just finally ask one last question, which is, can you make sure that we have a proper timetable so that this dialogue that is going on can be made really effective?
Sorry, say that again, Sybil, sorry.
Can we have a long enough timetable before the committee stage to make quite sure that we have a real discussion to ensure that we make the bill fully effective?
I'm always happy to engage with colleagues, as I said, and I think some of that engagement
You're
was
not
happening.
quite answering my question. I need enough time.
Some of that engagement and dialogue has already started, and it was happening today.
Thank you.
And before, and will continue to do so intensively up to committee stage.
Thank you.
Perhaps there can be agreement about the start of the committee stage, but I'll look at the correspondence when you write, Bill. We are now ready to move on to the next block of questions about the economy, the cost of living, and promoting investment. And we start with the chairman of the Energy Committee, Angus McNeill.
Thank you very much. Chair. Just before we go on to that, Prime Minister, there was a view, and I'm sure you've heard it, of many across the world, millions if not billions, I think Israel's committing a genocide in Gaza. I don't want to get into that debate here, but what I do want to mention is the ceasefire. On the 15th of November, when we voted in the House of Commons, and you didn't vote for the ceasefire, there were 11,200 people dead in Gaza. A month later, there's now 19,000 dead in Gaza. 16 times were killed on the 17th of October in the terrorist outrage, on the 7th of October, sorry, in the terrorist outrage. It is 5.5 times what were killed in Northern Ireland in 30 years. Isn't it time that you did put your voice behind the other hundreds of countries in the world that are shouting for a ceasefire?
I think I addressed this in a question just last week in Parliament, where I said we've been consistent in calling for sustained humanitarian pauses or indeed a sustainable ceasefire. But that has to be one that, as we've talked about before, has the conditions for it to be genuinely sustainable. And that means hostages have to be released and Hamas needs to not be firing rockets into Israel. Its stated aim is destroying Israel. So those are conditions of what a sustainable ceasefire is. And we are having that conversation with other colleagues around the world, but as I've said very clearly, no one wants this conflict to go on for a moment longer than is necessary, but it's important that ceasefire is sustainable, and those are some of the underlying conditions that are necessary for it to be so.
Viewers will see you as an outlier probably on the world stage there, but turning to COP26, one speech, some hours in Dubai, not as much as other leaders. I know you've defended that one, but that combined with your reverses on cars, on domestic boilers, on the change in the carbon budgets, are you serious about global warming, or you think it's just political positioning prior to the next election?
Yes, I am serious about tackling it, and I'm very proud of the UK's record. So we've decarbonised faster than any other major economy since the baseline in 1990 by about 50%. You can compare that to Germany 40-odd, France 20-odd, and the US hasn't dropped at all. And going forward, if you look at our NDC, our nationally determined contribution for 2035,
I'm okay.
again,
I don't need to go any further forward.
You've asked a question, am I serious about it?
Question,
the seriousness is demonstrated in our commitments, which again, at 68%, to 2035, more ambitious than the EU at 55, more ambitious than Australia at 45, more ambitious than the US at 40.
Reading out statistics is fine, Prime Minister, but I want to move on to energy prices, which are going up, affecting my constituents in the Hilling and Mere and everybody else's constituents. It's not much of a market forces you have when companies are being protected by the regulator to put up domestic prices because they say it's unpaid bills, but they're making huge profits. British Gas has reported profits of 969 million for the first six months of 2023, 900% up from the same period of 2022. The French state-owned EDF is making an absolute fortune in the UK with profits of about 2 billion. Scottish Power is seeing their profits up as well. E.ON too. Aren't you just giving blank cheques to power companies through the structure of the energy market?
So no, I think it's interesting. The first question is about saying you're walking back, which we're not, from targets on various things, on boilers and cars. And the next question is about the impact on consumer bills, right? So what we've done
the
is...
impact on consumer bills is due to allowing the regulator to raise the price for profitable companies. Enhancing profits, Prime Minister. That's what that is. So don't conflate the two.
I'm getting onto that, but I do think the impact on household finance is important, which is why my approach to net zero, and I get that you disagree with this, is one which is pragmatic. Because I care about the impact on family finances. So where there were opportunities
to say,
if you do,
where there are opportunities,
is this price cap going to rise? where there are opportunities to save families £5, 10, £15,000 by adopting a more pragmatic approach to net zero, keeping us internationally leading, but doing that in a proportionate way. I think that's the right thing to do to ease the cost of living pressures on families. Now, alongside that, I implemented a windfall tax on energy companies that is 75%, and we have used the money from that tax, which is one of the highest in the world on energy companies, to help pay around half of a typical family's energy bill over the past year. So that's what we've done. 75% windfall tax on energy companies, use that money to help pay for around half of a typical family's energy bill, and adopted a more pragmatic approach to net zero, which is saving families thousands of pounds,
in the UK,
because I think that's important.
I mean, British workers, according to the Resolution Foundation, are missing out on about 10,700 a year after a decade of weak economic growth, which you're in government for a large part and Chancellor of the Exchequer for a good part. And the living standards gap is about 8,300 between typical households in Britain and their peers in Australia, Canada, France, Germany and the Netherlands. Combined with that, poorer households are about £4,300 worse off than the French and German counterparts. That's a pretty damning indictment of where you've taken the economy, isn't it, Prime Minister? Both as Prime Minister and Chancellor, and you're generally your time in office.
I think what you failed to mention in your setup was the fact that we've
Yeah, the rest of the points I did mention, because I don't want you to go on another tangent.
I'm just answering a question, which I think I am allowed to do. But if you're going to talk about the economy and the impact of living standards without mentioning the fact that we had a once-in-a-century pandemic, which caused the biggest recession we've had.
But so did Germany, France, the Netherlands, Australia and Canada and other countries already.
And on top of that, a massive shock to energy bills because
so
of
the
the
war
war in
countries.
Ukraine. And indeed, Germany's economy is in recession this year. Ours is not.
Why are their wages on average then 10,700 a year better than the UK's? Given all you've said and all this world stuff, the UK is unique in this, and they've all suffered these things you've mentioned.
All of Europe has suffered a negative impact on their living standards. We're not alone in that, because all of Europe have seen their energy bills rise. So in all your stats, what you have to accept is if energy bills are going up across Europe, that's having an impact on everyone's bills across Europe. We're not alone in that. But what we have done is provide an enormous amount of support to people to help them get through it. And actually, again, in your international comparisons, we've had the fastest recovery from the pandemic out of any major European nation because of my track record and what the government did during the pandemic.
Final point, Prime Minister. Currently, the Republic of Ireland is in a surplus of about £10 billion. The Scottish Government are having a £1.5 billion shortfall. What are the broad shoulders of the UK? Isn't independence doing better for Ireland than being in the UK is for Scotland?
Well, the Scottish Government has received record funding from the UK government.
Not as much as the Irish government,
both the block
independent.
Again, to just answer the question, both the block grant and the most recent autumn statement mean that the Scottish Government is receiving a record amount of money from the UK Government. On top of that, the UK Government is investing directly in Scottish communities through the Levelling Up Fund and other such areas. And the UK Government is now cutting taxes for Scottish families, kicking in January. Now, obviously, if the Scottish Government has chosen to make different choices, that's for them, but we're very clear that we want to cut taxes for Scottish families because that's how we can help them with the cost of living, and we're able to do that because we're managing the economy well.
Liam Byrne for Business and Trade.
Afternoon, Prime Minister. I just want to follow up some of those questions. So, this Christmas we'll see sales of luxury cars and private jets and super yachts hit an all-time high. Yet food banks in my constituency are now running out of food. We've got homelessness at record levels, and last year 4 million people experienced destitution. Just tell us, do you ever lie awake at night worrying about the level of economic inequality in our country?
No, I want to make sure that we can reduce economic inequality and spread opportunity, and I'm pleased that we are making progress on that. So here are the facts. Income inequality is lower today than it was in 2010. The number of people living in absolute poverty is lower, 1.7 million fewer people, and the number of people in low-paid work is the lowest on record.
But you also know that wealth inequality is up.
Okay.
There are now 300,000 more children living in poverty. And if you take a step back, the top 1% in our country have multiplied their wealth by 31 times more than the wealth of everybody else. That doesn't sound like an economy that's working for everybody.
Again, as I just said, there are 1.7 million fewer people living in absolute poverty today than there were in 2010. That includes hundreds of thousands of children. And when it comes to the progressivity of our tax system, again, it's more progressive today than it was in 2010, where the top 5% of taxpayers pay around half of all income tax from memory. So the tax system has become more progressive, so the most wealthy are bearing a bigger burden, and we are reducing inequality, reducing poverty because of the actions of this
government.
government.
So why do we have the worst inequality of any major European economy?
All I can tell you is I don't have the international comparisons, but I can tell you from the level that we inherited from the last Labour government, we have reduced income inequality, and that's a record that I'm proud of.
But
those are the facts.
But wealth inequality has gone up, and there are 300,000 more children living in poverty after housing costs than there were a few years ago.
I think we just have different numbers, because on my numbers there are 1.7 million fewer people living
ONS numbers
in absolute poverty, as do I, including hundreds of thousands fewer children. And when it comes to children, no one wants any child to grow up in poverty, of course. And the best way to ensure that that doesn't happen is to ensure that that child is growing up in a home where their parents are working, because a child growing up in a workless household is 5 times more likely to be living in poverty than one that isn't. And that's why all our reforms to welfare, to support people into work, improvements to the national living wage, will do an enormous amount to continue making sure that more children are lifted out of poverty, as well as our recent investment in the local housing allowance, of course, which is considerable support for those families with housing costs.
But when we asked the public,
around about £800 for those most vulnerable families who are benefiting from the uplift that the Chancellor recently announced.
So when we asked the public about the best way to tackle inequality, the answer, top of the list, is the tax system, which you just mentioned. You would agree that a tax system ought to be fair?
I do. As I've said, we have a more progressive tax system today than the one we inherited in 2010,
and
where those with the broader shoulders are paying more than they did then.
You believe in the principle that those with the broader shoulders should pay more?
Of course I do. I believe in a progressive tax system, and that's what we've delivered.
So at a time when 1 in 5 people are now set to pay 40% tax, is it not wrong that those who take their income in the form of investment income pay a rate of tax that is about half that?
No, actually, the rate of capital gains tax on second properties, for example, is higher than it is normally. And with investment taxes, you're also balancing the benefit to the economy of investment that creates jobs for people. Now, I would never normally comment on tax policy beyond those broad principles. Those are obviously for fiscal events. But as I said, broadly, the investment taxes in this country are competitive internationally, and we have a more progressive tax system than we do today than we did in 2010.
But investment income has now doubled over the course of this century to about £80 billion. If you are a rich individual, maybe you're on a couple of million a year, when you file your tax return, you will be paying a tax rate of about 22%. That is much lower than 1 in 5 taxpayers today. Surely that is morally wrong.
I think it was Gordon Brown, actually, who was the Chancellor who reduced the rate of capital gains tax.
But we're not talking about Gordon Brown, we're talking about you.
Well, no, I'm just making the point that the person who made the change in our tax system, which has now persisted for a long period of time...
But you've been both Chancellor and the Prime Minister. You've had plenty of latitude to restore what you say is fairness to the tax system. I'm curious as to why you haven't done it.
I don't think there is, and again, I'm not going to comment on tax policy specifically, that wouldn't be appropriate, but broadly, I'm just making the point when it comes to capital gains tax, it was Gordon Brown who first reduced the rate of capital gains tax significantly below income tax, and that has persisted as a feature of the tax system from that moment through to today, and actually it has been increased for those on second properties, for example.
We've got wealth inequality that has gone up, not down. We've got the top 1% multiplying their wealth 31 times faster than everybody else. And you appear to be defending a tax system that means that those who take their income in the form of investment pay half the rate of tax of everybody else. That just doesn't seem morally right.
I believe actually, perhaps you were in the Treasury at the time when that tax system was instituted.
To be fair, that was 13 years ago, and wealth inequality has multiplied substantially since then.
So it wasn't morally wrong then, but it's morally wrong now.
Well, wealth inequality is now a much more serious problem than it was in 2010.
Okay, well, look, fair enough if you've changed your mind on it, but you were in the Treasury at the time.
And so, yes, it's perfectly legitimate to change one's mind.
As I said, the capital gains tax system, the main change that has been made to it since then is to have a higher rate of capital gains tax for second properties, for example. So actually it is even more progressive today than it was when you were in the Treasury, partly in charge of the tax system with the then Chancellor.
So Stephen Timms for the Work and Pensions Committee.
Thank you. Prime Minister, you will have seen the report from the Trussell Trust. That food bank demand in April to September this year was 16% higher than in the same period last year. You said when you came to the committee first time a year ago that you hoped that by the time of the election food bank demand would be falling. Do you think that's likely to be the case?
You know, I haven't seen that report, and so I can't comment on it specifically. Of course, I want food bank usage, as I've consistently said. You would prefer people not to have to use food banks, but as I've said previously as well, I'm grateful to all those people who are involved in providing them because they provide support to people. What we can do is to continue to lift people out of poverty, improve their incomes, and then support families with food costs as we do through things like the holiday activity.
I'm wondering
and food
specifically
programme.
whether the hope you expressed a year ago that food bank demand would be going down by the time of the election, whether you think that's likely to be achieved.
And what we've had, I think, probably since then is the significant inflation in the economy, which has impacted food prices as it has done other things, which will obviously make it more challenging. But look, I'm generally confident that the policies that we are putting in place are making a difference to help the most vulnerable. That goes national living wage increase, the support for the cost of living this year, the increase in the local housing allowance. All of these are things that particularly help the incomes of the lowest paid and those on welfare, and that will help, I hope, over time reduce food bank usage.
Okay, thank you. I very much welcome the rebasing of the local housing allowance, as you've said, from April to the 30th percentile. The last time that happened was when you were the Chancellor at the beginning of the pandemic in 2020, when it was rebased at the 30th percentile. In the 4 years from April 2020 until April next year, it's been frozen. And in that period, rents have risen quite a lot. So I think it's clear what's happened is people have had to dig into their other income, their other benefit income, in order to pay the rent because the housing support hasn't increased. I wonder whether you recognise that that has been one of the major drivers of increased food bank demand over this 4-year period.
I think it's probably hard to reduce food bank demand, as we know, is there are lots of complex reasons people are in food banks to one single factor. I think more generally, at a time when inflation, when I took this job, was running at 11%, clearly that's going to have an impact on household finances, and that will manifest itself in lots of different ways. What is important for me to do and the government to do is to make sure that we are targeting policy and support on those who most need it. The local housing allowance is a particularly good way of helping families. It's targeted on those on the lowest incomes, particularly those with children. It will provide around £800 to those who benefit
I agree
from
with that. Isn't there a very strong case for annual uprating of the local housing allowance, not having, as we have had, an increase and then a 4-year freeze and then another increase?
Look, I think there's lots of different ways government can do this, and there are lots of different competing demands on government's resources, ultimately their taxpayer resources. What government has done is uprate welfare going into this next year fully, which will be at twice the rate, or around twice the forecast rate of inflation. Right, so that is a significant uprating going into next year, well ahead of what forecast inflation is going to be. And again, people speculated about that, so the government has honoured that uprating in full. I said twice the rate of inflation, as well as this significant increase in the LHA. I think taken together, and the national living wage increase, these are all significant things that will help those on the lowest income.
Can I simply ask you to look specific at LHA? Because I think there is a very strong case for keeping it uprated rather than the 4-year freeze that we've had. At the start of the pandemic, you introduced the Household Support Fund, which has enabled local councils to provide a sort of last resort safety net for families with nowhere else to turn. We don't know at the moment whether that's going to be extended into the next financial year. I wonder whether you accept that there is a very strong case for extending it so that that very important safety net remains in place into the new financial year.
Yeah. It wouldn't be right for me to comment on future fiscal events. I think that was introduced during an exceptional period. It was introduced during the pandemic and then extended during the significant spike in energy bills. It's important to remember the context has not historically been a permanent feature of the welfare system. And what we have done going into next year, as I said earlier, was increase all welfare payments by the full 6.7%, I think it is, in spite of forecast inflation next year being less than half of that.
Yeah.
Now, that provides significant extra support to
I mean,
people.
that works both ways, of course. At times, the increase in benefits has been much less than the current rate of inflation. But you're right, you've stuck with a consistent formula. That's the right thing to do. I don't think it reflects particular credit on the government, but it's...
No, but I think it's rare that you have such a mismatch. And that's where...
Well, there was a bigger mismatch the other way round a couple of years ago.
I'm not. I mean, since I was Chancellor, we've consistently uprated welfare, and inflation has tended to, as I said, come in low, other than this past year when it's been higher, when we provided extra specific bespoke support. But what we do know now, again, things can change, going into next year, welfare will be uprated at twice the forecast rate of inflation. So that's just, whatever happened in the past is the past. From where we are today, next year, the change in people's welfare will be higher than the forecast change in inflation by quite a considerable margin. And I think it is worth that, together with the LHA increase, are quite significant amounts of extra support to those on the lowest incomes, rightly, because inflation is still higher than we would like it and things are difficult. So it's the right thing to do to focus on that, but I think it's worth just appreciating that those two things together are quite significant support.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Sir Stephen. Caroline Noakes for the Equalities Committee.
Thank you, Sir Bernard. I want to ask you, Prime Minister, about the cost of living crisis and its impact on women. We know in a financial crisis that the risk of domestic abuse increases. Has the government put in place enough practical steps to help victims of domestic abuse?
I very much hope so, because it is uppermost in our mind, and if you or others have suggestions on what we could do, I'd be very happy to hear them. It was always a priority for me as Chancellor at various fiscal events to provide funding for various different domestic violence initiatives to help reduce it and support those who are victims of it. And the Chancellor continued that most recently in the autumn statement with an additional £10 million of funding to help tackle both the economic impacts of domestic abuse, but also more investment into the flexible fund, which you'll be familiar with, provides support to those who need it.
So the Flea Fund, which I very much welcome, is capped at £300,000. Now look, it's a pilot, I accept it's a pilot, but do you think that's going to help enough individual victims who might wish to leave an abusive partner?
I mean, as you say, it is a pilot fund. My understanding is we'll be providing quite a significant uplift in the funding for it in the autumn statement, as well as various other things that already exist, which you'll also be familiar with. I think the other thing we're doing, which again is something that has been called for, is making changes to the child maintenance support system to make sure that people can request a switch to the collective pay methodology or means of collection, which was, I think, an important innovation. The government's committed to accepting, I think, almost all of the recommendations of the independent report about how we can improve the working of the CMS system for domestic abuse victims.
I'm glad you've moved on to the CMS. We heard at the Women and Equalities Questions Committee the week before last that the CMS is still not using all of the powers at its disposal to collect payments from non-paying parents, particularly the removal of passports, where none have been removed in the last 12 months. Should the CMS be doing better on that?
Well, I don't have the figures to hand, but I tend to agree with you. They should be using all the powers that they have to go after people who are reneging on their commitments to their children and their former partners. That's not right. It's not acceptable. And if the CMS have those powers, they should use them. The collect and pay request was a big request that I believe is now implemented, but I'll very happily look at areas where we could do more if powers are not being used, where they could make a difference to people.
So the government response to Samantha Callan's review into CMS and domestic abuse, and the response was published back in July, still says that it wishes to progress the recommendations strongly. Are we likely to get any sort of timescales on that?
Yeah, I'm happy to get back to you. I mean, so that remains our overall view of the recommendations. We've accepted, I think, almost all of them, and we are committed to taking them forward as soon as practically possible. I'll happily go through and make sure that we're doing it as genuinely quickly as we can, because I completely agree with you about the importance of this. People who are in this situation deserve all our support, and people walking away from their commitments should be pursued with all the means that we have.
So 84% of lone parents are women, and yet all we're getting on the Callan review is we accept the recommendations, we're going to progress them strongly. I think it's really important that there is some sort of timetable set so that those lone parents can know that they are going to be supported. Could I just move on to the issue of collect and pay? We've heard evidence in the committee and indeed from constituents that collect and pay cannot be used if the individual non-paying parent is not traceable by an address, even when the government, the CMS, has bank details, because they can't write a letter informing the individual that they're going to change to collect and pay. Shouldn't it be possible to do so?
I'll be completely honest, I will have to get back to you on that, and I will happily do that, because the broad thrust of what we're trying to do is make it easy for parents to request collect and pay where there is any evidence of domestic abuse against any of the partners involved. That is the aspiration, that is the thrust of what we're trying to do, but on that point of detail I'll have to get back to you if that's okay.
And just a final...
But I'll very happily look into it, because I think we are in agreement about what we're trying to achieve here.
We know that the average age of a female carer is between 55 and 59 years old, and I love this figure. 350 million hours, I'm familiar with the number 350 million, hours of unpaid care are done every single year, 59% of which is done by women. Is it fair to say that without the unpaid labour of women, the entire system would collapse?
Yeah, you are right. Our unpaid carers do an extraordinary job, and they deserve all our thanks.
The DWP appointed, I think earlier this year, Helen Tomlinson specifically to help women over 50 back into work. What evaluation is being done of how successful that's been?
I don't know precisely, but I'm happy to get back to you. But more generally, the thrust of policy at DWP, supported by the Chancellor, is to support those to be able to either come back or enter the labour market. We've seen a particular drop-off post-pandemic in the over 50s. The Chancellor has talked about this a lot, so we're investing far more in DWP, over £2.5 billion, in a range of different initiatives to support people back in. I think there's the midlife MOT and various other initiatives, but my sense is they are relatively early in their rollout, so I'm not sure if there will be a formal evaluation that's been done yet, but I'm happy to check and get back to you.
Can I give a formal evaluation of the Minister for Social Mobility, Work, Disabled People, and it seems everything else in the DWP? I think she's done an amazing job, and I think that she's absolutely the right appointment for that role. Is it not a little bit shameful that she's still doing that at Parliamentary Under-Secretary role and doesn't have the heft of being a Minister of State? Her predecessor, Tom Pursglove, said that he needed to get grip across government to make sure that disability champions were working effectively. Doesn't MIMS deserve that same recognition?
Well, I think what matters is action and what we're actually doing, and MIMS will completely remain or maintain our relentless focus on improving the lives of disabled people. And again, I've got a record that we're proud of, and we talk more broadly about the welfare system, but specific cost of living payments to those who are disabled this year. The disability employment rate is up by 10 points over the past several years because of all the initiatives that we've done. We're improving access at stations around the country. Something I'm personally proud of was the work I did as local government minister on improving the provision of changing places, toilets across the country, which we funded, and we're also maintaining our support for the Disabilities Facilities Grant, again something I'm familiar with from my old role as local government minister, which supports those who are living with disabilities to live more independent lives. So there's an enormous amount going on. I talked about the £2.5 billion of support into the back to work programs. Much of that is going to those with disabilities to help them enter the labour force, as many of them want to do.
The sector are very disappointed that it looks like that the role of Disability Minister has now been downgraded and indeed spread across a lot of other responsibilities. Should it have remained as a standalone job?
As I said, it has varied over the past several years and before in different roles. What's important is what is the government actually doing, and as you can see from the range of things I just highlighted, there is, whether it's making more accessible transport, changing places, support in getting to work, disabilities facility grant to enable independent living, or indeed support through the welfare system. An enormous amount this government is doing to support those with disabilities, and that will remain, and MIMS is completely committed to delivering on that, and I know she'll do a great job.
Thank you.
Sir Robert Goodwill for EFRA Select Committee. Thank you, Colonel.
Thank you. Families, particularly low-income families, are still facing cost of living pressures this Christmas. We've seen inflation levels not seen for more than a generation, and they've been primarily driven by food and fuel. I mean, we saw food inflation around 18% at one point. Now, we all understand that when crude oil prices fall, then the price of petrol and diesel at the pumps also comes down. But this does not seem to be the same case with food, where farm gate prices of commodities like milk have been falling, but we haven't seen the commensurate reductions on the supermarket shelves. Now, my committee has heard that increasing food prices are not being reflected in prices paid to farmers, with producers carrying the inflation increases in energy, fertiliser, feed and other input costs. What steps is the government taking to ensure greater fairness in the food supply chain?
Well, farmers should absolutely be paid a fair price for their produce. I know Robert and I will completely agree on that, and that's why the government previously established the Grocery Code Adjudicator, and it's important that the Grocery Code Adjudicator does its job, which is to enforce the code of practice, which has been set up with the big retailers to ensure fairness through the supply chain. There was a review of it earlier this year, and it is doing and can now do specific interventions in the various subsectors, eggs, dairy and others that you mentioned, but we're cognizant of the pressures on farmers, which is why we also removed the tariff, the 25% tariff on maize imports to help with animal feed costs as well, because I know it's a challenging time.
And we all understand that supermarkets are very powerful. 65% of the market is controlled by the biggest four supermarkets, and we've heard in our committee that producers are often frightened, reluctant to speak out about abusive practices. The adjudicator only looks at the relationship those who directly deal with supermarkets are concerned. Do you think we should maybe give more powers to the Groceries Code Adjudicator to look through the whole supply chain rather than just those that deal directly with supermarkets?
Well, it has just been reviewed this year, and I think was broadly found to be working well. I think obviously it has the ability to fine retailers up to 1% of turnover, which is a significant deterrent, I think. And I think what is more pressing is that it uses the existing powers that it has under the Agricultural Act to make sure it can go into the subsectors, as I mentioned, so specifically dairy, pork, eggs, horticulture, and the DEFRA ministers are able to use those powers to ensure that those supply chains are working properly. So I'd like to see those powers being used. I'd like to see those supply chains working properly, because as I completely agree with you, farmers deserve a fair price for their produce, and if that's not happening, we should be doing everything we can to make sure that it is.
So why haven't we seen the price of food on the supermarket shelves falling when farm gate prices have been falling?
Now, I think you'll know better than me that there is often a lag because of contracting and other things. Now, I'm not privy to the individual contracting, but where we've seen practices in other areas which we haven't liked, for example, the CMA's investigation of fuel prices and road watch, the government and regulators have acted. The CMA this year, as you'll be familiar, has looked at the operation of the grocery market. So this is something that it is looking at actively more generally. And I think between the GCA and the CMA, we do have two bodies who are very cognizant of the issues and keeping rightly a close eye on them. And if there was something that was found not to be working properly, I think all of us would want to make sure that they sought action to correct it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Dame Caroline Dinage on DCMS.
Minister, the Association of International Retail told my committee that the absence of tax-free shopping for overseas visitors means the UK economy could be missing out on as much as £12 billion in lost spending. Now there's evidence of that level of economic harm. Should the Chancellor look at this again?
I hope you'll forgive me for not commenting on specific tax policy in the committee. That would be obviously a matter for the Chancellor. I think there are a range of different views about that policy. I remember when I was Chancellor, I think fewer than 1 in 10 non-EU visitors to the UK actually used it, and the average amount claimed was something like £250 from memory, compared to an average trip price of closer to 5,000. So look, there are a range of different views as to this policy and the impact it's having, but obviously fiscal policy, tax matters are not something that you would expect me to get drawn into too much detail on.
But don't you think more work needs to be done on this? I mean, it's not only retailers who are affected, whether tourists come and how long they stay. That's having a negative impact on hospitality, on retail, on heritage destination, on theatres. Surely he should ensure that the Treasury at least look again at the knock-on effects of this.
Again, you wouldn't. I think the Chancellor's already said he's always open to getting people's submissions, thoughts, research and evidence in a general sense, so I kind of refer you to his remarks. But more generally, I agree with you about the importance of supporting tourism, and that's why the government this year has invested more in our various tourism initiatives to take advantage of the fact that things like the Coronation, Eurovision, the Open were all happening. I think Visit Britain had extra funding for a £9 million international marketing campaign this year to support the tourism industry, and I agree with you, it has knock-on effects in all those sectors, which are also getting government support through the 75% discount on business rates for this next coming financial year, which will help all of those, particularly small businesses up and down the country.
But since we left the EU, it's less attractive for overseas shoppers, it's more complex for overseas workers in tourism and hospitality, it's more challenging for overseas school groups to bring tourists over here. I just don't remember one of the selling points of Brexit freedoms, meaning that it would make our tourism industry less competitive. Do you?
Well, I'm not sure I completely agree. Now, obviously, things are going to be different after we left the EU. At no point kind of reprising all those debates, but this remains an incredibly attractive country to visit. Part of that is the flexibility and ease of people using the visa regime. And actually, on that, we rank incredibly favourably if you benchmark to most European countries to how they do their visa regime for visitors from the Middle East or indeed from Asia. I think our visa regime is far easier to use for those visitors, provides more flexibility than most of our European competitors. And that is something that particularly when I was recently in the Gulf, was remarked on and welcomed, because we're ahead of all our European neighbours and allies in providing that level of flexibility and ease for people to visit here.
Well, I think the hospitality industry would beg to differ. They're really struggling to get people over to spend their money over here to work in the industry. And I think what the culture, media and sports sectors are struggling to understand is to what extent Brexit could in any way be supporting them. You know, it's less attractive for overseas visitors to come here and spend their money. It's harder for UK performers to go to the EU and tour. And there's a haulage industry which used to be a massive employer in the UK that's undermined now by these cabotage restrictions. So what actual plans does the Prime Minister have to ensure any of our culture, media and sport sectors can begin to see any of the upsides of Brexit?
That's a broad thing. I mean, our cultural sector, more generally, and our creative industries are enjoying one of the biggest booms that they've experienced because of the government's policy in supporting them. The theatre tax relief being an example, our film tax relief, have led to record investment in our creative industries. It is booming in terms of the investment in studio space, post-production space. We are far outpacing all our European neighbours in terms of attracting that investment and growing the industry. I'll be hosting a reception for them just this evening, in fact, where they'll be celebrating all their success. So actually, when it comes to the creative industries more broadly defined, actually I think we're doing an incredibly good job, and rightly so, because they contribute a huge amount, not just to our cultural fabric and our society, but also to the economy. And I think the tax policies and other policies we've got in place are working in attracting that investment and creating jobs.
So if we look at our theatres and our cultural industries more broadly, I wonder to what extent the government really value and understand the global economic impact of them. Is it just about how they make us feel, or do we really understand the global economic impact? Let's take the National Theatre, for example. It's exports. I know the Prime Minister helped them celebrate their 60th birthday at Downing Street earlier this year. They export globally. Productions like War Horse, reach a global audience. Around about 17.5 million people a year are reached by that great British export. But they are operating despite underinvestment in their infrastructure rather than with the benefit of infrastructure investment. Do you understand how much that's risking both their sort of economic and their reputational damage by not investing in it?
So I think, actually, Karen, you and I spoke at an event at the National Theatre some years ago to celebrate the success of the Cultural Recovery Fund. So hopefully that gives you reassurance about my personal commitment to the sector. And I agree with you, it's not just about how it makes us feel, and that's why when I was talking about the creative industries in my previous answer, I specifically said it's about their contribution to the economy as well, and because they are an economic powerhouse for the UK, they're one of our big global growth industries where we are genuinely world-class at, so we can't ever forget about the economic contribution. I completely agree with that. And then with regard to the national, I think it is the third largest recipient of Arts Council England funding. It also benefits quite considerably to the tune of millions of pounds from the theatre tax relief that the Chancellor and I introduced, or the Chancellor improved, as well as the support they got through the Cultural Recovery Fund. That's on them specifically from ACE. I know there are some questions on the capital side, and the Cultural Secretary recently met with the ED from the National Theatre to discuss that, but broadly there is a public bodies infrastructure fund that DCMS have, which is investing hundreds of millions of pounds. I think I created it when I was Chancellor, and it's been topped up since. Things like National Museums, British Library and others benefit from that capital funding.
Thank you very much indeed. Ian Stewart for the Transport Committee.
Thank you. I'd like to start with the long-term future of the rail industry. The King's speech included the draft rail reform bill, and my committee will expedite its parliamentary scrutiny. But it's unlikely to become law this side of the election, and possibly not for a little while after that. In the interim, what's the government doing to help operators to grow revenue and passenger numbers and close the revenue gap?
Yeah, I think the rail industry received unprecedented support from the government during the pandemic to the tune of tens of billions of pounds to keep things running, to support jobs and maintain the network. And obviously, COVID has changed travel patterns considerably. It's right that the industry responds to that, and there's no sustainable future for it unless it does respond to changed travel patterns. None of this is helped by industrial action, which you'll be very familiar with. That is a significant barrier to forward progress being made. And the government, for its part, is, with the decision on HS2, making quite a significant change in how we allocate funding going forward to support the types of transport that people are using more often, more regularly.
But I appreciate, I'll come on to HS2 in a minute, but given that the GBR and the changes it will make is legally some way off, what can be done in the interim, for example, evolving the current national rail contracts, encouraging open access? That can be done now.
Yes.
Are you engaging with rail operators to make that happen?
Yeah, the Transport Secretary, look, we shouldn't wait for legislation to ensure greater sustainability of the rail networks. I completely agree with the sentiment. So the Transport Secretary is, as is the Rail Minister, in regular dialogue with industry partners about ways we can increase and improve sustainability and resilience of the rail network. An important part of that in the immediate future is industrial action, because that's having an enormous impact on the revenues of the network, and that's perhaps the biggest thing that could change in the short term to improve the financial sustainability of the rail network is no industrial action, which I would call very strongly on those unions who, not all of them, because many of them have now reached settlement with their operators, which is very welcome, but obviously there are some that are still going on strike, and that is damaging the sustainability of the rail network that we have in this country.
Thank you. I'd like to turn to HS2 now. You made that controversial change in October to scrap the second phase in favour of a bundle of other projects, which, although valuable in themselves, collectively they don't address the strategic capacity issues on the network, particularly the West Coast Main Line, which is the busiest rail line in Europe. Passenger numbers are ticking up. The change in travel patterns during COVID may turn out just to be a temporary phenomenon. Given that the West Coast Main Line north of Birmingham will soon be at capacity and there'll be no room for extra passenger or freight trains, what other work is the government doing to address that long-term capacity issue?
So I think on capacity, because the government is completing phase one provides capacity along the route, and I think it means that there will be space for about 250,000 passengers on the new, and it can handle, from memory, about triple the amount of demand that is currently travelling on the West Coast main line. I think from memory that's the scale of what the increase in capacity that's provided by proceeding with the government's plan. So given where we are post-COVID, that seems like quite a significant increase in capacity that's provided by the investments the government is making. But again, I know that where there are options to focus on pinch points and other things, the government will always look at those. But some of those are going to be done anyway as part of the significant investment that's going into phase one to handle, as I said, a tripling of the demand that is currently on the network.
Phase one will certainly address the capacity south of Birmingham to London, but there will be a bottleneck really between Birmingham and Manchester, and that will affect services further north to Scotland and so on. In the HS2 phase 2 was a solution to that capacity. That's gone. You can argue whether that's right or wrong, but Network North does not provide that additional capacity. So can I ask you to ask Network Rail to look at other options to address that long-term issue? Because otherwise 10, 20, 30 years from now, we'll be regretting this decision.
Yeah, my understanding is by completing phase one, there is benefits across the whole network, and as I said, it can handle, I think, about triple the level of demand that is currently on the network. That was my understanding when I last looked at it, but I don't disagree. Like in general, of course, Network Rail should be doing forward planning to make sure that the network can handle forecast needs, freight and passenger, and that should form its thinking as it designs exactly. Once phase one is done, there are questions about which services are used on which lines, and they'll be thinking about all of those things when they do the work on finalising those decisions.
If I may, I'll write to you with my concerns in further detail on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stewart. Prime Minister, Dame Meg has very kindly agreed to forego her remaining time, and that allows the Chairman of the Health Committee, Steve Brine, to ask a question, if that's all right.
Thanks, I'm very grateful, Prime Minister. Well done on, hopefully, a resolution to the NHS consultants dispute. How are you going to end the junior doctors' action? Find some peace on earth with the BMA trade union, given that the head of the NHS Confed said that the strikes the junior doctors have announced, 6 days, is the worst fear of health leaders come true?
So it's very disappointing that the junior doctors have rejected the offer. As you've made the point, we have now reached resolution with every other part of the public sector and every other part of the NHS. So over 1 million workers through the Agenda for Change deal that we did several months ago, including all our nurses, and most recently with consultants and the other doctor grades. So the only remaining people who have not settled are the junior doctors. And we have a clear set of terms with the consultants and with the other doctors. So there's a clear template here. And I'd also say that it was the junior doctors who received the biggest increase in their pay through the independent public sector pay process of around a 10% increase for a typical junior doctor. So they already were starting with the largest increase of any public sector workforce going into these talks. And as I said, every other part of the NHS, including all the other doctor grades, have now found a resolution with the government.
They are the indisputable facts, but how are you and your new Secretary of State going to end it? Because one of your main pledges stands at risk as a result of this ongoing industrial action, which you have quite rightly said.
Yes, I mean, on waiting lists, I'm pleased that the longest waiters, that we have successfully eliminated the number of people waiting 2 years and 1.5 years virtually, which is good progress. But overall waiting lists obviously are impacted by industrial action. I think what we have seen in the past month or so, when there has been no industrial action, you have seen the waiting list come down. And the amount of elective activity that is happening in the NHS when there's no industrial action is at record levels. So you're right, the industrial action does have a big impact. Now, ultimately, the government has demonstrated its considerable reasonableness, and the proof is in the fact that it has reached resolution with every other workforce, not just in the NHS, but in the public sector more broadly. So the question more is for the junior doctors as to why they are refusing to accept something that everyone else has now accepted, on top of having a pay increase, which is more generous than anyone else's, set by the independent body going into this.
Every MP in the House would have a story for you about NHS dentistry. You've seen the story in the press today, the Nuffield Trust saying it's its most perilous position in its 75-year history. When will we see the dental recovery plan? Can it be a New Year present?
Yes, it will be in the new year. Obviously, there's £3 billion that's been invested in NHS dentistry with a reformed contract, which is helping. And I think the amount of activity this past year is 20% higher than it was the year before. So there are progress has been made, but of course, as I've acknowledged, there are still things that need addressing, which is why it's important that we do get the dentistry recovery plan published.
And we'll see that early in the new year?
I couldn't give you a precise date, but it is being worked on, and we want to make sure that, as I said, it builds on the progress that we've made this year, where there has been a considerable increase in the amount of activity because of the reforms to the contract and the funding. So about 20% more activity than previously, so that is good progress, but there's obviously more to do.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Questioning, and I'm very grateful. You've been skillful at helping us keep to time, and I thank my colleagues too. Just remains to wish everyone, including you, Prime Minister, and everyone in the government and everyone present, a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.
Merry Christmas.
Order.
The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding